The committee will come to order. We are here today to examine the instability on the African continent caused by the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, led by wanted war criminal Joseph Kony, also Boko Haram, also al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Thank you. And to conduct critical oversight of U.S. counterterrorism efforts in the region. The ranking member, Mr. Berman, and I are foregoing opening statements and submitting them for the record for today's hearing, and I've asked our members to do the same so that we may receive testimony, conduct member questioning, and be able to adjourn today's hearing by 10:45 at the latest in order to quickly go over to Statuary Hall and be able to participate in the memorial service for our friend and our departed colleague, the late Don Payne. And that is all right with you, Mr. Berman?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I know, Mr. Smith, you'll be speaking at the memorial service as well. So the chair is pleased to welcome our witnesses. First, we'd like to welcome Donald Yamamoto. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. He previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia from 2006 to July 2009, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs from 2003 to 2006, and U.S. Ambassador to Djibouti from 2000 to 2003. We welcome you, Mr. Ambassador. Next, we'd like to welcome Daniel Benjamin. Ambassador Benjamin is the coordinator for counterterrorism in the Bureau of Counterterrorism. Prior to his appointment, he served as director of the Center of the United States in Europe and as a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution from December 2006 to May 2009. For 6 years, he was senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies from 94 to 99, and he served on the National Security Council staff. Thank you, Ambassador. And last but certainly not least, I would like to welcome Amanda Dory. She is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Prior to her appointment, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy from 2008 to 2011 and Principal Director for Policy and Planning from 2007 to 2008 and as a strategist from 1999 to 2002. Without objection, the written statements of our panelists will be made a part of the record, and we ask that you summarize your remarks. Without objection, we will begin with you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Put it just a little closer.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. In the face of terrorist threats and insecurity in Africa, military solutions in the first instant, while important in some cases, may prove counterproductive if not implemented and addressed in the context of other measures. We must therefore consider addressing the wide range of economic, political, and social factors that fuel conflict and insecurity and take a comprehensive, holistic, long-term approach. The situation in Mali, for instance, represents a microcosm of the complex problems challenging Africa and the need to address security concerns within a wider context. There are 4 distinct yet interrelated crises facing Mali, which must be managed separately yet simultaneously. First, a return to civilian authority and the reaffirmation of democratic institutions will ensure a strong, united country able to address other crises. Second, a democratic government must reach out and engage in dialogue with the Tuareg people of the north, addressing their concerns. Third, Mali faces a humanitarian crisis of well over 190,000 internally displaced as well as refugees in neighboring country. And fourth, Mali and its neighbors together have a stake in confronting the challenges posed by AQIM and other splinter groups such as Ansar al-Din. These challenges cannot be addressed in isolation, but as interrelated issues. Security is fostered by the establishment of sound leadership, accountability to the people, transparent and democratic processes addressing the needs and aspirations of the population. We look to security challenges through a wide lens, and that includes the 5 pillars articulated by the President in Ghana in 2009. And those 5 are strengthening democratic institutions, fostering broad-based sustainable growth, combating disease, improving public health and education, mitigating armed conflict, and helping Africans with transnational threats. Whether it is AQIM, al-Shabaab, or Boko Haram, extremist ideology, even those masquerading in religious terms, are antithetical, illegitimate, and repulsive to the vast majority of Africans. Extremism is a violent cancer that exploits porous borders, capitalizes on human suffering, and feeds in undemocratic environments. Our engagement will be difficult but necessary and must be based on several fundamental principles. First, regional ownership. Leaders must inspire their people, and countries must own the process to address the challenges effectively. Our African partners have consistently said African security is Africa's responsibility. Second, promotion of good governance. Our security engagement cannot be separated from our long-term goals of good governance, civilian control of security forces, and respect for human rights. Extremist ideologies takes advantage of political and economic vulnerabilities. They destroy lives and strengthen instability. Building credible government institutions at all levels and assisting legitimate authorities to respond to the needs of their people are vital objectives. And three and final, the development and economic opportunity. Investing in economic and social development is crucial for improving the security environment in Africa. Efforts to address insecurity are often hampered by poor infrastructure and the inability of national or local authorities to provide adequate services, educational and vocational opportunities. The road that we face will be long. It will be hard. It will be difficult. But through patience, hard work, coordination with our African partners, and promotion of democratic values, human rights, and opportunities will make a significant difference in the lives of Africans and for future generations. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much, and I would like to tell our wonderful panelists that you will notice that not many members are here right now, but as I explained to you, at this time from 9 to 10, we have our party conferences, so all of the members are elsewhere, but we've got the committed crew here. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I join my colleagues Ambassador Yamamoto and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dory in welcoming the opportunity to discuss terrorism in Africa. I've submitted testimony for the record that provides additional information about the Counterterrorism Bureau's programs and initiatives in Africa. Terrorism is a real threat in Africa, and we have a whole-of-government strategy to diminish that threat by building the capacity of our partners that have the will to take effective action and work cooperatively with their neighbors to deny terrorists the ability to move among their countries. This will require our sustained engagement, but we are already seeing positive results. We are also working with the nations of the region to counter violent extremism, thereby denying terrorists new recruits. We use all the instruments available to us: diplomatic, development, law enforcement, military, and intelligence. And we work bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally through organizations like the Global Counterterrorism Forum. In considering the various terrorist threats across East and West Africa, the challenge can appear daunting. The great expanses of desert, porous borders, under-resourced governments, all these create an environment that offers many advantages to terrorists. We also remain concerned by reported communications, training, and weapons links between AQIM, Boko Haram, al-Shabaab, and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. These may have strengthened Boko Haram's capacity to conduct terrorist attacks. However, the lack of resonance of the al-Qaeda ideology within most communities and the commitment of the regional governments to join forces to counter the terrorist threat have helped contain these groups. If continued, these efforts will ultimately lead to their marginalization. That said, a number of different factors have converged in recent years to create a new and worrisome set of openings for terrorist organizations, particularly in the Sahel, West Africa, and the Horn of Africa. The turmoil associated with the ousting of the former Libyan regime has profoundly affected parts of West and East Africa. Loose Libyan weapons and the return of refugees and mercenaries to their countries of origin across the Sahel has greatly increased the internal pressures faced by these countries. The current Tuareg rebellion and subsequent coup in Mali were spurred by these events, and they have created a vacuum in the north of that country that has provided AQIM with greater freedom of movement. AQIM has historically been the weakest of the AQ affiliates, yet recently the group has managed to fill its coffers with ransom money from kidnappings. These newfound resources, the arms and the money, together, along with the recent instability in Libya and Mali, have raised concern about this group's trajectory. In Nigeria, long-standing political and socioeconomic grievances in the north led to the creation of Boko Haram in 2001. The group's attacks in the north, including one in August against the United Nations headquarters in Abuja, signaled its ambition and its capability to attack non-Nigerian targets. U.S. counterterrorism strategy in Nigeria is closely linked to the broader strategy of support for the Nigerian government's reform efforts and increased respect for human rights. We are providing limited law enforcement training assistance to the Nigerian government while also working to accelerate diplomatic efforts to convince them of the need to change their strategy with regard to Boko Haram from a primarily military response to one that also addresses the grievances felt by many in northern Nigeria. Al-Shabaab also continues to threaten countries in East Africa. In February, Al-Shabaab and AQ released a joint video to formally announce a merger of the two organizations. And while it has demonstrated a willingness and ability to conduct attacks elsewhere in the region, as we saw with the July 2010 attack in Uganda, Al-Shabaab's attacks have primarily focused on targets inside of Somalia. With the assistance of both the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, and Somalia's neighbors, the transitional federal government has made significant gains in degrading Al-Shabaab capability and liberating areas from Al-Shabaab administration over the last year. Yet much work remains to be done in the region to further reduce the threat of terrorism while working to safely provide humanitarian assistance, including to those inside Al-Shabaab-controlled territories who are denied access to outside aid. The Department of State has a number of Africa programs to address the various emerging threats presented by these terrorist groups and other drivers of instability. And in this vein, the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, TSCTP, and the Partnership for Regional East African Counterterrorism, PREACT, are designed to strengthen the capacity of regional governments to combat terrorist threats and counter violent extremism, while also fostering regional cooperation and building lasting partnerships. We believe we are making progress with a number of partners. Algeria, Mauritania, and Niger have achieved real results against AQIM in the last year. For example, with the defeat of AQIM twice in the Ouagadougou forest on the border of Mauritania and Mali, the defeat of AQIM in the Mauritanian town of Bessekinu, and the capture of arms convoys transiting from Libya by joint Algeria-Niger operations. In the interest of time, I'm going to conclude my remarks here. Additional information on our various programs in Africa, including anti-terrorism assistance, countering violent extremism, and counter-terrorist financing, are provided in my written testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Story.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the sources of instability in Africa. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the loss to the nation and to the committee of Congressman Payne. At the outset, I would like to note that African states and regional organizations are making significant progress in developing the ability to address security concerns and sources of instability on the continent. We are seeing this dynamic reflected in the robust role of the African Union mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, as well as in the African Union's leading role in facilitating negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan, and in the economic community of West African states' work to facilitate a potential settlement in response to the recent coup in Mali. Nonetheless, our partners in Africa still lack key capabilities to address all of the varying sources of instability across Africa. Given this reality, the Department of Defense, in conjunction with the Department of State, continues to assist our partners on the continent with building their capacity to respond to security threats. Our efforts in this respect take multiple forms, including security assistance, exercises, rotational presence, advisory efforts, and training and equipping, as I'll discuss in the context of specific threats. By assisting capable and willing African partners to address threats like the Lord's Resistance Army, al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and Boko Haram, we help our African partners to create the space necessary to continue developing politically and economically, which benefits both Africa and the United States. DoD's efforts are implemented in accord with two tenets from the recently released Defense Strategic Guidance. The first one is that acting in concert with other means of national power, U.S. military forces must continue to hold al-Qaeda and its affiliates under constant pressure wherever they may be. The second tenet is that wherever possible, we will develop innovative, low-cost, and small-footprint approaches to achieve our security objectives on the African continent, relying on exercises, rotational presence, and advisory capabilities. For example, in the operation to counter the Lord's Resistance Army, a small number of U.S. forces are supporting regional military forces in an advisory capacity and seeking to enhance our partners' capabilities to achieve their objectives against the Lord's Resistance Army. Elsewhere in East Africa, in response to the terrorist threats posed by al-Shabaab, DoD has provided train and equip support to African forces deploying as part of AMISOM using Section 1206 funding. In the fiscal year 12 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress provided DoD with an additional important tool through an East Africa-specific Train and Equip Authority, Section 1207N, that is focused on building the capacity of the counterterrorism forces in the East Africa region. These authorities complement the program goals and objectives of State Department's Partnership for Regional East African Counterterrorism pre-act that Ambassador Benjamin has just referred to. In the Maghreb and Sahel, DoD works closely with State Department to plan and implement the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership to address the threat posed by AQIM. DoD's military-to-military activities under the TSCTP seek to build the counterterrorism capacity of key partners in the region. These include Section 1206 authorities to train and equip partner nations, as well as joint combined exchange training events, and an annual counterterrorism-focused exercise on a regional basis, Exercise Flintlock. Based on proliferation concerns following the regime change in Libya, DoD has also incorporated Man-Portable Air Defense System, or MANPADS, awareness and mitigation training into our mill-to-mill engagements. In Nigeria, the expansion of Boko Haram's capabilities is a source of increasing concern. In January 2012, DoD participated in the inaugural meeting of a regional security working group under the auspices of the U.S.-Nigeria Binational Commission, with a focus on our cooperation in response to the Boko Haram threat. Most recently, our efforts are focusing on counter-IED and civil military operations, where our engagement and cooperation can support the mutual goals of addressing Boko Haram. We will continue to explore further areas to build Nigerian counterterrorism capacities. To sum up, in partnership with the State Department, the Department of Defense is working to address the range of sources of instability in Africa, from terrorism to piracy, with our partners across the continent and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you for your excellent testimony. We will begin our question and answer period. I wanted to ask about the Lord's Resistance Army. President Obama announced following the completion of the National Security Council Progress Report that the U.S. will continue the deployment of a small number of U.S. military advisors to assist regional forces of countries fighting the atrocities committed by Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. Please describe the goals and the status of U.S. efforts to counter the LRA and remove their operational capacity of the LRA leadership, and how is this success being gauged? Also, if you could describe the relationship between private and U.S.-funded efforts to establish local cell phone and radio-based monitoring and alert systems for LRA-affected communities. What happens to non-leadership LRA defectors, both with regards to their intelligence value and the psychosocial needs and the capacity to be integrated, if at all possible, into their home communities? And finally, how frequent have defections been since the initiation of the current program of U.S. efforts to counter the Lord's Resistance Army? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
First is the goals and objectives of the teams, and I defer to Amanda Dory to give explanations as well, is to build interoperability and build up the training programs of the 4 countries that are involved against the LRA. Right now, the goals and objectives are really fourfold in order to isolate Kony and his the other leaders, to support and assist those who are leaving, also to help with rehabilitation and reconciliation efforts. One of the things that has been proven very effective is what you just said, Madam Chairman, and that is the cell phones. Not so much high tech, but basic good work. The USAID has provided about $100,000 to $200,000 worth of cell phone towers. And when it does it, it helps alert communities when LRA groups are in the area. The other thing, too, is on the number of defections. We've been working with the countries to do these encourage defections, but also reconciliation and rehabilitation. As you know, in the beginning, about 1.8 million to 2 million were displaced in Uganda. We are up to about 385,000 in the Congo and neighboring areas. The Ugandans, for instance, themselves have spent about 50 million in just this reconciliation. We are doing the same in those areas. I think the success rates is good. The issue is that it's only a matter of time. And I think that's, and we also want to thank you, Madam Chairman, and this committee for the support on the counter-LRA legislation and programs.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dory?
To amplify Ambassador Yamamoto's, am I on? Yep. To amplify Ambassador Yamamoto's comments, the DoD deployment is in support of the broader counter-LRA strategy that's a comprehensive one across the U.S. government. The first leg of that is focused on civilian protection. The second, as he's referred to already, is on the acquiring defections and reintegrating LRA detainees back into society. A third leg is providing humanitarian access. And then the fourth, and this is where DoD is at the forefront, is working to support the removal of Joseph Kony and key leaders from the LRA from the battlefield. So the advisory mission that DoD is engaged in is really working with and through the local militaries, 4 different military partners in the region. We have a variety of metrics of success and benchmarks that we're using looking across the strategy. It includes looking at the ability to provide humanitarian goods, so the level of our access over time. It includes looking at the number of defections over time, the captures, excuse me, number of captures from the battlefield. From a DoD perspective, some of the metrics that are important to us, the building of trust and relationships with each of the partner militaries, the access that is provided. Things that we focus on are the reducing the amount of time from information that's garnered, whether through defections or other means, to actionable intelligence for use by the tracking teams, the Ugandan forces in particular, and looking at how we shrink the time between the intelligence and information to actual operations conducted. So that's a key metric as far as we're concerned.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and please keep the pressure up. Thank you. Mr. Berman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and I have a bunch of questions. I'd like the first couple to be real quick answers if possible so I can get them in. Ms. Jory, on the 4th objective, can you give 100 military advisors working with local militaries and military partners, why haven't we been able to kill or capture Kony?
That is an excellent question. One of our biggest challenges with the mission collectively is expectations management, and I think that's what you are helping us focus on. When you look at the operating terrain involved, many use the comparison to the size of the state of California. Heavily forested, very limited infrastructure. It's very challenging terrain in which to find a small number of needles in a haystack. So that is the terrain challenge that faces the operating forces in the area.
But this does remain one of our objectives there, I take it.
Removing Joseph Kony from the battlefield
Yes.
and his key lieutenants remains one of our objectives. A second
Okay.
challenge relates to the level of logistics support for the fielded forces. So given the terrain challenges, given that you have 4 different regional militaries that are working in collaboration together, is a very challenging operation.
Okay. Second, maybe Ambassador Yamamoto. The Dodd-Frank legislation required the administration to prepare a map of mining areas and rebel-controlled areas to give us a sense of the relationship between, on the issue of conflicts, mining, and support for these rebels. Where is that map?
We'll be getting the mapping soon. We have been tracking all the mines and what types of materials is being produced. As you know, Mr. Berman, the Congo produces probably about 8% of all the minerals that are needed for cell phones and other types of high-tech equipment that we use in our daily lives.
Yeah, but the map.
And the map is coming out soon, sir.
Soon?
Yes,
Like,
sir.
like,
I've seen drafts and we worked on it. And one of the issues on the mapping is that these are artisanal mines that kind of spring up and then they close, et cetera. And those are very hard to calculate. But we do have mapping, et cetera, ready.
so you think we'll see that by the end of May?
Before.
Before, all right. So a larger question, how do our executive branch agencies balance this desire to build cooperation on counter-terrorism with the desire to promote human rights, good governance, civilian control of the military? You take Uganda and Ethiopia, they're strong partners on regional security, but neither of these governments are tolerant of strong political opposition or civil society. They're both hostile to free press. How do you ensure in building up the counterterrorism capabilities that we're doing no harm to democracy and human rights? And the integration of the different roles to rule of law programs in coordination with the security and capacity programs for the security forces.
I will perhaps leave some of the specifics on Ethiopia, a country that Ambassador Yamamoto knows very well, and Uganda to him. But I would say that an integral part of our anti-terrorism assistance is always human rights training. There's always a human rights component to what we do. Desi Dori can address what's done by DoD and its capacity building efforts. And it's also an integral part of our message to these countries that if they wish to diminish radicalization, that it's absolutely essential that they observe human rights norms and ensure that that first contact or the sustained contact between citizens and the agencies of the state are benign ones and not ones that will, in effect, have a radicalizing impact. That's a core effort within what the CT Bureau is doing. And we have any number of different programs going on that are designed to underscore and promote human rights observance in all these contexts. I think perhaps Ambassador Yamamoto might have more details on this for you.
Just a couple areas. In Ethiopia, we have the NCO and officer training program. And what we've learned now is that those trained troops are better troops. They're obedient to civilian control, and they're very disciplined. They are one of the main peacekeeping operation troops in Darfur and Abyei and other places, and also within their own countries. The second area, too, is that we've been working with the Prime Minister Melis and his government on various committees and groups on
You
how
could
to
turn on your microphone and speak closer.
on how to improve democracy, good governance, and various other programs. And so therefore, we're going to enter another program here in the United States. We've did another program in Addis last year. So I think these efforts and areas are getting the message out, and we are having a lot better on coordination and cooperation.
I think my time has expired.
Yes, it has. Thank you so much. Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you very much.
And if I could ask each of you to hold that microphone really close.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony, to our very distinguished panelists, and for your service to our country. Just again on Joseph Kony, if you could tell us what priority is being given by the United States and by the respective militaries in Africa to the killing or capture of Joseph Kony. We all know it's a priority, but how high is it? And how degraded is Kony's ability to murder and force young people into child soldiering?
Right now is in the I think it's off, but in the coordination of the four countries, the priority is very high. In our discussions with, let's say, President Bozize and his defense minister, who is his son, they have been very high on the priority in trying to coordinate with Ugandans, the DRC, and other southern Sudan in order to cordon off his escape routes and try to capture him. So it is placed a very high priority, and they've taken the leadership and the ownership in that regards.
And again, how degraded is his ability to wage his war of terror?
And on Kony itself, you know, we've been able to degrade his forces. It's now down to about 150 or so. There's about 800 who are accompanying him, but the number of defections have increased. The only problem, of course, in this the last 3 months, the number of attacks by Kony's group has increased, but we are trying to limit those areas of operations.
What is the reward or rewards for information leading to his capture, and how is that information disseminated?
The information right now is, and again, we thank the members of Congress on the Rewards for Justice. That's a good program. What it's done is given up more publicity and to really advertise. And also the Invisible Children have done a great job with their Kony 2012 to get the message out. And so there's nowhere for him to hide, et cetera. And so therefore, we are looking at much more publicity. And
but how is that information gotten out? Is it by radio?
Right.
And to whom do they bring the information to?
The average people in the areas, and so therefore they know how to work, to coordinate, to cooperate, and to further isolate and help in the capture of Kony.
Have we gotten credible leads?
Sure.
As to his whereabouts?
Could I just add
Yes,
a few accompanying points? The message in terms of encouraging defections and being able to provide monetary compensation in response to information leads is going out through leaflets that are dropped by air. It's going out through radio. It's going out through the linkages of the forces and the civilians in the area. So it's, you know, kind of moving along the different pathways of communication. The intelligence community assessments, as well as what our partners are telling us in terms of how degraded is Joseph Kony, the common assessment is that he has been significantly degraded and is in a survival and evasion mode at this point, and on the move on a regular basis. So I think those are encouraging signs to us that are shared with our partners.
Two final questions, because I'm almost out of time. In the late 90s, I chaired a series of hearings on the bombings in Tanzania as well as in Kenya. And I'll never forget when General Crow told us at the hearing right here in this room how disappointed he was that while on the short term there's a vigilance, that vigilance wears down, and with the now emerging threat of homegrown terrorist organizations, how aware and how vigilant are we to those threats? And secondly, how has the consolidation of power by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic parties in Egypt affected the jihadist organizations in sub-Saharan Africa, the nexus between Cairo and South?
Thank you very much, sir, for those questions. On the issue of vigilance and homegrown or self-starters, I think we are as vigilant as we possibly can be. It is well known that the challenge regarding the homegrown threat is the intelligence collection is very, very difficult if people are acting on their own initiative and communicating little, if at all, with others who share their ideology. But we are extremely concerned about this, and we note, for example, that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in its various publications is encouraging individual attacks, people not coordinating and the like, and we certainly share your concern on that, and we're working as hard as we can on it. Regarding the Muslim Brotherhood, I think it's important to know that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has not been associated with any violent attacks since the 1970s. In fact, it has engaged in a very, very sort of virulent debate with al-Qaeda over many years. It is certainly true that Egyptian internal security has been challenged somewhat in the aftermath of the revolutionary events in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, but Egypt remains a close counterterrorism partner. As you know, the Internal Security Service essentially was replaced, and the new one is being built. But we have not seen the developments in Egypt having any notable effect on AQIM or al-Shabaab or others in one way or the other, and I don't think we expect to see any. Those groups may benefit from some of the turmoil in a place like Libya, for example, because of loose weapons, but not because of what's going on in Egypt. And I would just say in closing that, if anything, the transition to democracy is a huge blow to violent extremist groups, because it demonstrates that change can come through peaceful measures and not, as bin Laden and others always communicated, only through violent change. So we view this actually as a hopeful set of developments, not one without bumps in the road, but nonetheless a very positive turn.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bass is recognized, and she's now the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Africa.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Before I begin, I wanted to mention that Mr. Smith and I tomorrow will hold a hearing on the current and escalating crisis engulfing Sudan and South Sudan. It's clear that if we're to see real lasting peace and security, we must address some of the underlying causes of unrest and discord, not merely in Africa, of course, but around the globe. So I had a couple of questions I wanted to pose in this regard. How are our development and diplomacy efforts at USAID and the State Department directly addressing some of the root causes to strife and unrest? And what good governance and democracy promoting programs are having real success?
Thank you very much. I know that in your hearing tomorrow, you'll have Princeton Lyman and Aerogas, and they can address those in greater details. But generally, we've been working nonstop on the diplomatic side, working with countries like the Arab League and China to disengage the forces between the North and the South, particularly around Heglig, et cetera, to bring stability to that region in the southern Kordofan and Blue Nile region. On the area of USAID it is our largest humanitarian assistance program in Africa, and we will continue to address not only the humanitarian assistance issues, but also development, the education, and the healthcare programs. And I think tomorrow you'll get great details on the projects.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else.
I would just add to that and say, broadly speaking, we in the Counterterrorism Bureau view our mission as being focused to a large extent on the strategic dimensions of counterterrorism. And by that I mean that we're looking at the upstream factors, and we're looking at those drivers of radicalization and trying to figure out what we can do to blunt them and to diminish the likelihood of there being more recruits. We are involved in quite a number of different rule of law efforts and in countering violent extremism efforts that are trying to provide alternatives, for example, for at-risk populations, particularly youth. And we also are involved in the messaging side of things and have been deeply engaged in the stand-up and the operations of the Counterterrorism Strategic Communications Center, which was created by an executive order from the President within the State Department. It's an interagency effort, and we have great support from DOD and from others in the interagency that is meant to essentially challenge the vast amount of propaganda that is out there, especially from al-Qaeda-related groups, and try to prevent people from embracing the ideology and turning to violence.
Could you expand a little more on what you were saying about the youth in terms of how you're specifically addressing the youth?
Well, we'd be happy to give you a lengthier briefing on that. There's an awful lot going on, but we recognize that the people who are most at risk of becoming radicalized are the young. We are conducting programs that complement what AID does, in the sense that they are doing the longer-term development work that is meant to provide key social services that obviously ameliorate the grievances that lead to radicalization. We're looking at hotspots, areas where we see particularly intense areas of radicalization, and trying to figure out what we can do there on the level of a state, a city, even a neighborhood, and figure out what it is that is driving radicalization there and what we can do to provide alternatives, often working with civil society organizations that are going to be better interlocutors with these young people and will be more credible with them and steer them away. So there may be leadership programs for young people, other kinds. It could even be sports. It could be something that is bringing them together to establish a better relationship with law enforcement in the area.
Before I run out of time, I would appreciate it if you would give me more information at another
we'd
time.
be glad to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions in regard to the Reward for Justice program. And as Mr. Smith was asking questions about the reward for the capture of Coney, I was just wondering, in terms of the defections, have you been able to have some of his major lieutenants defect? Have people been responsive to the rewards program?
That's correct, and there have been defections, especially of the lieutenants and other groups coming in and providing information about where locations. But again, you know, Coney is such an elusive character, and he travels very stealthily, so it's very difficult. And they also do in small groups.
When you mentioned that he had stepped up efforts and attacks, has some of it been in retaliation to our efforts in terms of the cell phones where the leaflets have been dropped? Has he been attacking those specific areas?
I think that needs further assessment, but I think it's just basically random violence right now in many areas.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Bass. Ms. Schmidt of Ohio is recognized.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. The first is, how is the state and the DoD coordinating with resources to combat threats throughout the region?
I think we have very close coordination from the working level on up to the Situation Room, particularly through 2 comprehensive programs: the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, which deals primarily with the Maghreb and the Sahel, and also with PREACT, which is its corollary in East Africa. Our staffs work very closely to identify needs and important programs that can address those needs, both on the military and the civilian side. And we feel that there's really an excellent give and take on these issues. Perhaps Amanda has something else to add on that.
Just briefly, to amplify from a DoD perspective, what Africa Command has been able to do is to develop cross-cutting regional campaign plans that are part of the DoD approach to engagement and long-term planning. So we have a Northwest Africa campaign plan, for example, that fits and aligns with the State Department TSCTP. Similarly, in East Africa, there's an East Africa campaign plan that aligns with the PREACT countries. All of those benefit from State Department input, but are written and promulgated in DoDEs, so they're able to be understood and cascaded within the DoD structure.
I know that AFRICOM is in parts of on parts of the continent of Africa. Where does it come in on stabilizing the region? AFRICOM, our military presence to help certain countries make their military more professional, and it's a partnership, and where is that coming in all of this?
Sure. I can respond both in the mission space and then organizationally. From an organizational perspective, what you see is 3 different nodes where Department of State and Department of Defense are interfacing and developing the strategies and the policies. So here in Washington, clearly, is one location. The second location is at AFRICOM headquarters in Stuttgart, where you have a very heavy interagency presence to include a State Department deputy to General Ham alongside a military deputy and many State Department and AID personnel. And thirdly, at the country team level, ambassador-led, you have the senior defense officials who are engaged with State Department officials there. So we have something of a three-legged stool when it comes to...
And how are you measuring its success, AFRICOM's success?
AFRICOM's success in the first instance is to prevent the threat of attacks against U.S. interests, against the U.S. homeland, against Americans overseas. By that metric, I think we have a fair degree of success to report, but remain on guard and ever vigilant. The next mission for the command is to focus on contributing to partner capacity to be able to extend regional stability. That's really where we're focused in the hearing today when we look specifically at terrorism. And I think capacity building is one of those long-term objectives where you measure your inputs in terms of the training hours that you provide, the equipment that you provide, the advisory services that you provide, and then you look at security outcomes. Some of the ones that we talked about in the opening statements include regional partners stepping up and acting in the threat when faced with insecurity, such as the AMISOM mission in Somalia as clear evidence of this is where we are able to successfully contribute and support our partners on the continent.
Okay, focusing now on Boko Haram in the terrorism situation. I know that Representatives King and Meehan wrote Secretary Clinton requesting that the State Department list Boko Haram as a terrorist organization under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act and Executive Order 13224. What is the status of the request, and what criteria haven't they met to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization?
We are very concerned about Boko Haram and are addressing this issue through a number of different means in terms of our engagement with the Nigerians and the like. But the State Department as a policy doesn't comment on potential or prospective designation. So I'm afraid I can't give you any more insight into that right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Schmidt. Ms. Wilson, my Florida colleague, is recognized.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Chair. The video, The Invisible Children, really captured the people of America, especially the child soldiers and all of the devastation that's happening. And it had me so upset, I offered a resolution. I was just astounded. And I'm just wondering, last year Congress authorized up to $35 million per year in the budget for 12 and 13 for increased support to regional counter LRA efforts in the 2012 NDAA. Does the DoD intend to obligate the full authorized amount? If not, how much? And to what extent will this funding offset State Department payments for logistics? Or will it expand activities beyond the current State Department funded logistics support package?
Thank you. Department of Defense appreciated the authority provided under 1206 that's focused on countering the Lord's Resistance Army. The department does intend to use the authority. It was not accompanied by an appropriation, so we are in the process of identifying the possibilities in order to fund the authority. What we have at this point is well-defined requirements provided to us via Africa Command. I think we have agreement between the two departments. As you know, this is a dual key authority that requires the concurrence of both the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. Our intent is to use the authority to provide logistics support to the regional partner military forces. This is something that the State Department is currently undertaking using peacekeeping operations funds. As DoD takes over that logistics support contract, we intend to increase the level of logistics support to the partner militaries. The other thing that we intend to use the authority to do is to provide additional supplies to the different operations fusion centers that have been set up with the partner militaries by the deployed U.S. forces.
Okay. Just a follow-up, Madam Chair. We saw the invisible children and in America, and it was riveting. How many people do you think in the affected areas actually were exposed to that video to help them understand what was happening with their own families, own surroundings, neighbors? How do we get that to them so that they can see and understand what's happening with Mr. Coney?
You know, just talking to Ben Kesey and on the invisible children, it's really, it galvanized the United States and people in Europe. If you talk to the people in the affected areas, they live it, they understand it. 66,000, as you know, Representative, 66,000 kids have been abducted. You're talking about 2 million nearly displaced. And so the terror that Coney has launched in those areas are very much understood very well by the people. And going back to your previous questions as well, is how do you measure success? How do we go after Coney? And the answer comes in is that the Africans themselves, they know it. They've taken the ownership. They're going after Coney. They're taking the lead. And they're taking ownership of all of these programs to help coordinate and cooperate. The issue is that how can we help them with interoperability, communications, coordinations? You know, militaries, the CAR is probably less than what it is in Uganda. How do you bring those to the same level and the cooperations? But to answer your first question, Madam Representative, is the people in these affected areas know very well, and they are very thankful to the United States for this effort, thankful to the Congress for doing legislation. And so what you're doing here in the House really resonates very well in among the citizens in Africa.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Duncan of South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. You know, I first off want to give a kudos to the group, Invisible Children, and raising global awareness really about the plight in Africa and the Lord's Resistance Army, what it is, what Joseph Coney has done, and I understand our efforts from the United States to address those as well. I guess I'm concerned about what I see with Sudan, with what I continue to see with al-Shabaab and the radicalization efforts. I know this committee and Homeland Security have talked numerous times over the last Congress about radicalization and al-Shabaab's recruitment here in the United States. And so I guess, Ms. Dorey, the question for you, and this is going to be my only question today because I'm interested in listening more than I am interrogating you guys. But what types of U.S.-supported counter-radicalization efforts have been most successful, in your opinion?
I'd be glad to start, and I know Ambassador Benjamin has ideas as well. I think from
Madam Chairman, could I please ask the witness to speak more loudly?
No, this
Thank
is
you.
about my fourth request. Please, 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 please. We're going to give you a multivitamin. So speak right into the microphone, and it makes for a better hearing. We can all hear you.
Very good. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you. I can give you a few insights from DoD perspective, and I think State Department will have some to add as well. I think when we look at the counterterrorism mission space, recognizing the complex roots of the terrorism problem in the first instance, DoD has some very effective tools, as you're aware, to focus on training and equipping of partner counterterrorism forces and to undertake counterterrorism missions directly ourselves. We complement those through efforts to counter violent extremism, counter radicalization, some of the things that Ambassador Benjamin has been referring to in terms of information operations, for example, other efforts to outreach and engage. I think it's a complex space, and to be able to identify any particular element as the particular piece that is the most effective is a challenging thing to do given our limited understanding of how terrorism operates and expands over time. But my short answer to you would be it's the complementarity of the different types of trying to focus on terrorist leaders and reduce them over time, and focusing on drawing up the pool of recruits and prospects to diminish those who enter onto that path in the first place.
Yeah. Ambassador Yamamoto, do we see other countries in the region assisting us at the level I think that Americans would expect other countries to assist us in the anti-radicalization effort, our fight against al-Qaeda and world threats?
Yeah. I think it's in different terms. Is commitment, yes, they are committed. But how, going back to your first question, is really kind of how do you reduce radicalization in Africa? And some of the areas that we can have all the programs in the world. What's going to be important is are those countries addressing and meeting the needs of the people? I mean, look at Nigeria, Mali, and other countries where you have problems of instability because of clans and groups, et cetera. And the issue is, can we work with governments to address the needs of people who feel they're disadvantaged? The other issue is education and healthcare. You know, living in Africa, on a good day in East Africa, 1 out of every 10 children will die before the age of 5. And if that's a concern for parents, a concern for kids themselves, then that's a concern for us. And working with these governments to address those needs, that's been important. The other issue, too, is education care. If you talk about 70% of Africa's 1 billion people now are under the age of 30, and most of them are under the age of 25, education is a big issue, and also job creation and economic development. And so in those contexts, I think if you want to reduce radicalization, those are the areas, holding governments accountable to their people, making sure that they're addressing those needs, and two, working systematically with us on education and healthcare. And I think a lot of countries around the world are doing that, and I think we're making a lot of good inroads.
Ambassador?
If I may add to that a bit, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Dory said, you know, the variety of pathways to radicalization is enormous. And so we find someone like an Abdul Muttalib who was educated in elite schools being radicalized. We find people in poor villages where they are subject to inadequate education and extremist ideology being radicalized. There are really countless different pathways. Ambassador Yamamoto is exactly correct that if the high road to counter-radicalization is putting pressure on governments and enabling them to provide services to their people. That will obviously diminish a lot of radicalization. Good governance and democratic institutions will make a big difference. The rule of law and the like. We can certainly talk at much greater length about this.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Connolly of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I got to say, I met with a number of young people from my district earlier in this week about the subject of John Coney and the LRA, and I was very impressed and remain impressed at the mobilization online that has occurred throughout this country and indeed throughout the world on what otherwise might be an obscure African issue far away. And I have to believe that, frankly, the mobilization of our young people on such an issue, focused on human rights, focused on the tragedy that has occurred in East Africa, I think can only be to the good. And shades of my own youth in college on getting involved in Biafra and Bangladesh, if I'm showing my age. But I think it's a great thing. I met with one young man who was from Uganda and whose village was targeted by Coney and the LRA, and his brother indeed was abducted. He managed to flee into the bush, but one of the points he made was there was no protection. Mr. Yamamoto, Ambassador Yamamoto, you've mentioned correctly that there's a level of awareness through radio and other means that certainly the word's gotten out about the need to avoid the occasion of trouble, but frankly, his point was there was no protection. The government isn't functional in large swaths, or wasn't at his time. He's not that old. And so I want to focus on that. What about institution building? What about the capacity of the Ugandan government to expand its writ and to protect its citizens from these kinds of tragic depredations?
And that's the heart of a lot of the issues that we're trying to work on. This person probably, the LRA, of course, started out of the Acholi region of northern Uganda, where you had over 1.8 million people displaced. And how is the government coping with those really staggering numbers? And those are issues that we've been trying to help with capacity building. I know Ambassador Benjamin and his group have been doing
if I
training.
can, Mr. Ambassador, that is already sort of a consequence of the failure of the government. You don't have displaced people if the government has the capacity to, in fact, protect people and provide law and order.
Right, and that's the issue, is how to build capacity. That's one angle.
Well, how are we doing on it?
I think we've made tremendous progress in the last decade through a lot of programs and projects to build institutions, to build training programs, to do, we have INL programs to train police, have militaries being more responsive, doing better coordination and cooperation. I think those are areas that we've done well.
Those are all good metrics for what our inputs, but what about the output? Is the Ugandan government, in your view, showing, and other governments in the region, in fact, more resilience, more efficacy in providing protection and in deterring the ability of the LRA to operate?
That's right. Well, the LRA is not operating in Uganda anymore. They're now in Congo. But those troops from Uganda are in the Congo, in the CAR and other areas to help coordinate with those military forces to go after the LRA. And then the context is to how to build up security in Uganda. As you know, Congressman, Ugandan troops are also in Somalia helping there in stabilization. So they've done a tremendous job in the last decade.
Okay. Part and parcel of this conversation also is sort of our building partnership capacity efforts throughout Africa. We've put a lot of money through 1206 into countries like Mali. Is it your same assessment that they have also proved to be effective?
Mali was a great disappointment because this is a country that was on the right track, and the coup basically set it back a great deal. And so now we're starting from scratch to do rehabilitation and to restore good governance. But there are people in place and coming up who can fill the void, but we're going to give them the opportunities.
A great disappointment. The coup leader in Mali was in fact trained by the United States, was he not?
That's right.
With funds under this program?
That's right. That's correct.
So does that cause us to reassess our own effectiveness in this kind of program?
I think one person doesn't detract from the overall goodness of the program.
Well, that one person overthrew an elected government.
That's right. And right now, I mean, just look at throughout Africa, we now have over about 200,000 trained troops through these programs, through IMED, FMF, et cetera. And there, 80,000 are now in peacekeeping operations doing good jobs. And so we can't judge on Captain Sonugo and his insanity and what he did.
Well, I think you'll forgive the American people for wondering a little bit
Sure.
about how effective their tax dollars have been invested when that's the outcome, even if it's one guy.
That's right.
He sure did have a big impact on the country, and as you point out, set back in many ways many of the investments we've made since 2006. Mm-hmm. My time is up, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
You know, Madam Chairman, I believe that Mr. Royce was here before me, but
So sorry, I did
but
not
I
see you.
appreciate
Thank
your
you.
consideration.
Sorry, it was not in my sight of line. Thank
Also
you.
appreciate your Cuban coffee.
Thank you. Mr. Royce is recognized.
Oh, I thank my colleague from California, and thank you, Madam Chair. Going back to this point of the 800,000 people who are displaced in northern Uganda, there's a reason they're displaced. It's one man and one warlord. And when we think about what could be done to bring Joseph Kony to justice, one of the most important things is apprehending him. Tomorrow, a very important event occurs, and that is the sentencing from the War Crimes Tribunal that's going to be handed down with respect to Charles Taylor. And that is an issue that this committee worked for years on, how to get him apprehended and then turned over to the bar of justice. Because no matter how much money we had spent in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in the region, and across West Africa, there was no way to keep up with the mayhem he was able to cause. And certainly between now and tomorrow, there are going to be a lot of people in West Africa hoping that this decision tomorrow will see him put away for life. But in terms of the apprehension here on Joseph Kony, I have legislation, H.R. 4077, to to allow for a rewards program. It has bipartisan support. Our military is interested in having it put into action soon. So I just mentioned that in the hopes that we can help move this legislation, get your views on that. Also, I wanted to ask about how involved al-Qaeda in the Maghreb is in terms of the drug trade. Because one of the things we found in terms of the nexus with Taylor was his willingness to be engaged in the diamond trade, in blood diamonds, and these types of activities to get his hands on the hard currency. So if I could ask that question as well.
If I could start on the Rewards for Justice program, just to express the support of Department of Defense and General Ham at Africa Command's
Thanks, Ms. Story.
endorsement. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good to see you again, Mr. Royce. On the issue of the drug trade in AQIM, AQIM has managed to fill its coffers quite effectively with kidnapping for ransom. In the last few years, they have really acquired millions and millions of dollars through this practice. Now, AQIM does operate in the same area that some of the smuggling and drug trading lines run through, and they may there may be some racketeering, essentially, some effort to shake down the drug traders and extort rents from them to operate in those areas. But by and large, we haven't seen AQIM turn into a drug cartel or a drug organization.
Let me ask you another question then, and this will go to Boko Haram in Nigeria. We saw the first suicide attacks there recently, and those are the first in Nigerian history. But if we look back at al-Shabaab and what happened there as it began to morph, it launched its first suicide attacks back in 2006. And recently, you've got the full, strategic alliance with the announcement, the public declaration recently that they're joining forces with al-Qaeda, that they're part of al-Qaeda. How similar is the fact that now we're seeing this change in tactics by Boko Haram? I know a governor from northern Nigeria who's told me that he sees the Gulf state influence there in terms of radical ideology in some of the imams teaching locally and changing the culture to the type of culture that we saw with al-Shabaab being driven by radical ideology. Tell me, I'm trying to gauge where we are in this process, but what can we expect in a few years from Boko Haram, in your opinion?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I would say that it is clear that Boko Haram has gotten some training and adapted some of the tactics that are common to the AQ affiliates, and we believe that that happened principally from al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, not from al-Shabaab, although there are sporadic contexts there as well. We have also seen that Boko Haram has adopted or at least shown its ability to target non-Nigerian targets as it did with the UN, and that is a worrisome sign. But I would say that it is still a heterogeneous group.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to ask the ambassador. I mean, this is nice to see you again, Mr. Ambassador. We've, over the years, had several major little confrontations of our own. I'd like to ask you, do you believe that a lack of democracy and human rights feeds radicalism and terrorism, and is that so in Africa?
There are always various reasons. I think fundamentally the issue is if a government is not accountable to its people, then that really goes against President Obama's first pillar, which is good governance, democracy, and in institutions. And so the issue comes in as, yes, without those accountability and democratic institutions, then you have problems.
And I remember that we had some concerns earlier, the two of us, but just for the record, you were ambassador to Ethiopia from 2006 to 2009. And during that time period, there were some major human rights issues in Ethiopia. Can you tell us what the United States, my recollection is that the government got away with murder in Ethiopia. I mean, and we let them get away with that. And did that in some way, has that in some way fed the radicalism of Africa today with, as compared to people who, if you would have had an honest democratic government in that huge country of Ethiopia, it might have been more of an example, a positive example, rather than something that fed terrorism?
I think Ethiopia, specifically in Africa in general, I think different issues, but on the Ethiopia issue, we went in and really had heart-to-heart talks. I met with all the NGO groups, the local communities, with all the opposition groups. We worked very hard behind the scenes. As you know, we had 21 of the people who were placed in jail, the political prisoners, released. We got those. That took a long time, but we did it. And the other issue is that we started now intragovernmental issues, discussions with Ethiopia, the United States. We're heading to discussions this summer, and the topics are on democratic values and how we expand institution building and how we develop this relationship. Because again, Ethiopia is an important country not only on counterterrorism issues, but also as a symbol for what is the stability for that region. And one of the stability, as you said, Congressman, and you've been a great advocate, is democratic values.
Well, I would hope that pressure from Congress and perhaps from this committee actually assisted you in having those prisoners released. And I would hope that our government makes it clear to people like those who govern Ethiopia that we take this very seriously, and the corruption level and the repression level in that country and in other countries in Africa is unacceptable. Let me ask a little bit about the financing of this. And as my colleague just mentioned, Blood Diamonds, I saw that movie. It was a terrific film. But I tend to believe that perhaps there are other people to focus on in terms of the financing of these radical and monstrously violent groups that are marauding around Africa. What role does, I mean, if we're talking about al-Qaeda and that in Africa, are the Saudis playing a role in financing this as they have in other parts of the world? And is China playing any role, a positive role at all, or are they playing a negative role in these confronting these type of horrible attacks on decent government in Africa? To the whole panel, that'd be fine.
Thank you, sir. The primary finances for the radical groups that we're concerned with come from kidnapping for ransom and crime, different kinds of fraud, theft, you name it.
No evidence of the Saudis are
Well, there may be
from the outside.
And with al-Shabaab, it's also such things as the charcoal trade and their control of the port of Kismayo and the taxes that they put on that port. There may be external donors, but it's a minor part of the overall funding picture.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman.
And our last questioner will be Mr. Rivera, another one of my Florida colleagues.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll probably direct my questions to Ambassador Yamamoto and Ambassador Benjamin as well. It is my understanding that Polisario-run refugee camps in Algeria have become a recruiting ground for al-Qaeda in Morocco, a hub for opportunistic Polisario drug traffickers, and a threat to the region and the reforms, or some of the reforms at least, that we saw in the Arab Spring. Since 1990, international support for the camps has exceeded $1 billion, is my understanding, and that U.S. aid exceeds $300 million for these camps. So in essence, it appears that the U.S. taxpayer is being called upon to partly fund the operation of camps that are being increasingly exploited by regional terrorist groups. So how is the administration dealing with this appearance, at least?
Sir, I've seen reports of al-Qaeda involvement in Polisario camps, and whenever we have dug deeper, we have found that those reports were spurious. I am happy to go back and have a look again and see if there's anything new that has come in on this. But on a number of occasions, we've investigated these allegations in the past and found that there was no substance to them. But why don't we get back to you on that to ensure that we have up-to-date information.
Okay. Ambassador Yamamoto, anything to add? Okay. That's all, Madam Chair.
And I would be interested in that information as well. Thank you so much. We'd like to remind the panelists and the audience and members that at Statuary Hall at 11 o'clock, we'll be walking from here to there for a memorial service and celebration of our departed colleague, Don Payne's life. And I know that he was a very important person to each and every one of you. So thank you very much. And with that, the committee is adjourned.